interesting activity in terms of seeing how people view women in conflict with the law and their situation. And now we're in the really important part of our dialogue. As you can see here, we have this statement: women in conflict with the law deal with bias and stigma from different sectors of society, including the justice system, social service agencies, and even their own communities. I think it's very important that before we start the dialogue, we give a little context because, for example, over the last 25 years, the number of women and girls caught in the criminal justice system has increased. Many have been subject to sentencing for nonviolent offenses, and this responds to what was submitted by one of the participants. And globally, there are now more than 200,000 women behind bars and more than 1 million on probation and parole. Many of these women struggle with substance abuse, mental illness, and histories of physical and sexual abuse, but not all of them get the services they need. We are dealing with similar challenges in our own jails and prisons, and these are further compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic. And the Philippines, in fact, has the seventh highest incarceration rate of women in the world. And over 90% of women in the Philippines are incarcerated for nonviolent crimes, with 75% of the women's cases drug-related. So the situation of WICL is dire, and it's crucial for us to discuss and address their unique situation. And their needs extend beyond legal assistance to include social services, as well as understanding and support from their own families, communities, and society as a whole. So I think now we can call on our panelists. We can pose our questions to them and they can respond. So we can start with Judge Azon. We know the importance of rehabilitation services and social integration to prevent high reoffending rates. In your perspective, what role do rehabilitation and social services play for women in conflict with the law?
Good afternoon. Before addressing the question specifically, I would like to just give some context. My sharing is in the context of developments in the drug in the Philippines, particularly RA 9165, and how does rehabilitation come in? Because previous to 2117, we hardly had, rehabilitation at all, because there were only few cases filed for voluntary rehabilitation. It was only in 2017 when the court, declared as unconstitutional Section 23 of RA 9165, that rehabilitation came in. So what is this Section 23? Section 23 of RA 9165 says that you cannot avail of plea bargaining in drug cases. Compared to all other criminal offenses, only in RA 9165 that plea bargaining is not allowed. But in 2017, the Supreme Court declared that particular provision unconstitutional, and therefore says, the Supreme Court said now accused in drug cases can plead guilty to a lesser offense. And in 2018, the court issued the guidelines or the framework to guide judges in approving motions for plea bargaining. In this Supreme Court resolution 1803-16, the court introduced rehabilitation as part of the penalty to be imposed on the accused if they are found positive after undergoing a drug dependency examination. In other words, beginning end of 2017, and more specifically with March 2018, when the court issued the guidelines on plea bargaining, the court said that, okay, in drug cases, you can plead guilty from, if you are charged, for example, with Section 5, which is selling, you can plead guilty to the lesser offense of Section 12, which is punishable from, Section 5 is punishable by life imprisonment, and now you can plead guilty to Section 12 with a penalty of like 6 months to maybe 1 year, 2 years, depending on the judge. So it's a really radical, in a sense, change or development in drug cases. But the court said that in addition to that penalty that the court will impose, the drug offender has to undergo drug dependency examination. If found positive, will undergo treatment and rehabilitation. As a result of these guidelines, from 2018 up to middle of this year, we have had a total, change in the criminal justice system with the introduction of plea bargaining in drug cases, because we all know that drug cases are the majority of cases that clog the courts and the jails. So we have been approving plea bargaining, and because of the approval of plea bargaining, we have been sending people to undergo drug dependence examination. And then the recommendations from the physicians who conduct this drug dependency examination depend on the severity of the dependence on drugs. So the highest is a residential inpatient rehabilitation. The second one, lesser, is the intensive outpatient rehabilitation. Then lesser than that would be community-based rehab, and finally counseling if you are not dependent. Now, the problem is, in my case, in Region 10, there have been no, from the time I became a judge in 2010 of a drugs court, I have seen no facility for inpatient rehabilitation for women. It is only this year, 2021, that we had this facility for women, government facility for women rehabilitation, but it is somewhere 260 kilometers away from Cagayan-de-Oro City. So what have I been doing? Every time I get this recommendation for an offender to undergo residential inpatient, I have no choice. In the past, I would just say, you have to just go for outpatient rehabilitation because there's no facility for women as opposed to men. There is one here in Cagayan de Oro, and there's a big one in Balay accommodating as many as 500, I think, but no facility for women. That is one disparity that we have. So of course that affects the kind of service that is available for women who are involved in drug cases. So that is one important thing that I can share for now. Yep. Any other questions?
Thank you, Judge. I think it's very telling of gender inequality, what you just told us. And obviously, there are challenges when it comes to providing equal services for women and men. So I think now we can move on to Attorney Kathy. Let me ask you this question. How does this lack of social services impact women in conflict with the law when they return to their communities?
Good afternoon, Jona. Good afternoon, Judge Ason and Karen and everyone in the audience. Like Judge Ason and as Jona mentioned, that about 75% of all the women in conflict who are in detention in the Philippines are charged with drug-related offenses. So I also want to point out that we cannot separate the effect of our punitive drug policies from the issue of the stigma and discrimination that women face. Many women face stigma and discrimination at the level of the community, from their families, and there is clearly a lack of support to rebuild their lives after imprisonment. And the effect of that is that, well, because of our punitive drug policies, there is already a, how do you call this? Women who are charged with drug-related offenses are seen as having done something which has like a moral failing. It is seen as a moral failing. And so there is judgment. They receive judgment not just from the legal system, from the justice system, but also from their families and their communities, that they have done something bad, and so they may not be deserving of assistance from social services, and that is if social services are available at all. And so I think it's very important to point out that there is a need to really look into how our punitive drug policies, the criminalization of issues that are supposed to be, for example, managed through public health or through should be seen as a socio-economic and public health issue, also impacts how our women in conflict with the law experience stigma and discrimination. And I also just wanted to add that there is really no clear community reintegration program after you have served your sentence or after your case has been dismissed and you are released back into your community, there are programs in writing, but when you ask the local governments, when you ask the barangays, women who have been released from jail or women who have been released from detention, they are not really prioritized in terms of the provision of or the planning of community reintegration activities, especially now with everyone all hands on deck when it comes to COVID-19 response. So this really impacts how women are, accepted back into their families, how they can get back on their feet. It's very hard to find uh, employment if you have had a record of, having been detained or having been convicted of an offense. So it's really hard for you to get a job, and I think this contributes also to reoffending. If you cannot find work within the legal system, and there is available income from illicit means, and your family is in need, your family is hungry, how can you refuse to participate in illicit activities again when you are in dire need? So a lot of these things contribute to the situation, to the stigma and discrimination that women face, both in while they are going through the criminal justice process and after. So thank you, Jonah. I hope I was able to shed some light.
Yes, those were very important points, Attorney Kathy. And I noted the different forms of discrimination that you mentioned that women face in different levels, from their families to the communities, and also the overall lack of support for them. So, given this lack of support for rehabilitation and social reintegration, to what extent can alternative measures create maybe better social outcomes for women in conflict with the law?
Thank you, Jonah. I really like this question because it introduces the idea that you don't actually need to send people to jail. We have a lot of our policies, a lot of our laws seem to have this. It's like a reaction that for every social problem that we have, our solution is to send people to jail. But we can see that through alternatives to incarceration, there's actually a lot of situations that could be avoided, a lot of stigma, a lot of discrimination, and a lot of trauma. You can just imagine the trauma on the lives of women and their families when they go through the situation of arrest, and all of the other processes in the justice system that really is, even for us lawyers, it's traumatizing, even more for women who are not even aware, why are they being arrested, what is my crime. But a lot of these things, like you said, a lot of the offenses for which women are detained are non-violent offenses. And so I think there's really a need to re-examine, to allow and to open our communities to the idea of alternatives to incarceration, looking at ways to avoid having people entangled with the criminal justice system when it's, for example, when it's possible to divert them to social services or to divert them to public health. For instance, if you are caught in possession of drugs, what if the response is, instead of arresting you, you could get an assessment where you could be checked if you need, if you need access to healthcare, or if the reason that you are involved in this is you need mental health assistance, or if the reason why you are engaged in committing illicit, if you're engaged in the commission of crimes is because you are in need of livelihood for your family. Explore these responses that do not require women to be entangled with a very traumatic experience of being in the within the criminal justice system. So I hope this discussion this afternoon, opens us up to that idea na you don't always have to send people to jail to solve social issues. Thank you, Jonah.
Agreed, Attorney Kathy. Okay, we can ask our next panelist. Sorry, did someone want to say something?
Can I just add something?
Yes, please.
Yeah. I think I'm a bearer of bad news. There's this irony of we were talking about. I was just talking about now after 11 years, I am in drugs court. Finally, there's this rehabilitation facility for women. But guess what? The irony now is that we have suspended plea bargaining in many courts now because of a recent ruling of the Supreme Court in People versus Rhea 4. So the immediate problem right now really is increasing jail congestion. I am for what Attorney Cathy is suggesting. I am hoping we can do a pilot run of some kind of project similar to what they have in Seattle, the LEAD, Law Assistance, Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion Project. But as it is with the law right now in RA 9165 and the ruling of the Supreme Court in People versus Rhea 4, it's a very, sad, situation right now that we have. Because of the recent ruling on People Rhea 4, the Supreme Court upheld the right of the prosecution to object to plea bargaining. But the DOJ, the prosecutors always object to plea bargaining because they have a different set of rules. And they're saying, we cannot agree to plea bargaining in Section 5 cases unless the accused will plead guilty to Section 11. Unlike in the Supreme Court guideline, it is Section 12, which is a much lower offense. But for the DOJ, it's Section 11, which has a penalty of at least 12 years. So why would somebody plead guilty to Section 12, Section 11, which will send him to imprisonment of 12 years? Because of this, we have suspended practically plea bargaining. So we cannot even talk about rehabilitation from here on, except for a very few cases now, because most of the cases involve Section 5. Section 5 is non-bailable. Section 5, there is always an objection from the DOJ. So that is the very sad news that we are facing. I'm really hoping that the Supreme Court will reverse the People versus Rhea 4 ruling. We have been talking to the Philippine Judicial, this is the Judges Association has come up with a letter to the Supreme Court. If they can, talk as an unbank to really review the impact of this ruling, because this will impact on the congestion rate of our jails. It's really bad. I looked at I asked the BJMP for their national, the congestion rate right now is 415%. That's average, But if you look at the highest congested jail, the rate is 2,430% or 26 PDLs per cell. This is in San Mateo, Rizal. Now, without plea bargaining, this will go even higher. I hope the Supreme Court can really look at this thing, It is a very...
Thank you, Judge Azon. I think this is a very interesting technical discussion that maybe when we also at the end of the Q&A session, you could provide some more context, especially for our lawyer and judges audience, which I'm sure we have quite a large proportion on the call, to go into even a more detailed discussion. I think that would be a really interesting idea to further evolve on. Thank you for sharing. Jona, over to you. Hopefully the Commissioner Karen can respond to what the judge said and also to shed some more light on the impact of bias and stigma to evoke the rights of the women. Thank you.
Karen?
Yes, thank you very much, Jona. I don't know if you want to I'll respond first to the judge's proposal. No? One of the things that we're really trying to take a look at, and I didn't want to miss this chance to respond right away, is of course that's very welcome to actually try to raise this issue with the Supreme Court. But perhaps this is one of the things as well that's being discussed in the deliberations of the amendment to the Dangerous Drugs Act. One of the things that perhaps we can include, if it cannot be cured by a reversal by the Supreme Court, then perhaps an introduction of a provision in the proposed amendments to the Dangerous Drugs Act can be one of them. No? But having said that, also, as you know, the Philippines is also working with the UN on the UN Joint Program on the addressing the Philippines human rights situation, and this arose out of a Human Rights Council resolution on technical cooperation and capacity building. But just to be able to say and to put it out there that the UN Joint Program can also assist in addressing these issues to be part of recommendations that can be made to be able to ensure that there is a human rights-based approach to drugs control, which is one of the areas of concern of the UN Joint Program. But having said that, I want to just briefly answer the question about how does bias and stigma against women in conflict with the law in different sectors curtail the enjoyment of rights. As you know, the Commission on Human Rights has a mandate, and that mandate is to be able to independently visit and monitor places of detention without need for any permission from any custodial authority. And that is a constitutional mandate. And we have long observed that how stigma against persons deprived of liberty impact their enjoyment of rights. And as PDLs, as we call them, they are vulnerable to a whole range of rights violations, including, of course, incarceration, which we have heard somehow earlier, and even before that, even in arrest and even after incarceration. And this could manifest in terms of treatment, in the conditions of jails and other detention facilities, even in terms of taking a look at access to justice, and subsequently in the success or failure or even absence of rehabilitation programs. So, in the case of women deprived of liberty, the persistence of gender inequality in society even renders WDLs, or women in conflict with the law, more vulnerable to stigma and its impact. Women experience stigma and discrimination not only because they enter the criminal justice system and are seen in general as criminals already, even if they have not been found guilty, and not as rights holders. They also experience stigma on the basis of their gender and other identities. We have heard of stories of how women, not only in the drug war context, but women who are actually being abused by authorities so that they can just get away with it and all those things. No? So like other PDLs, they are often seen as not holders of rights, having failed to conform with gender stereotypes, of course. They face stigma of being branded as bad women and face vulnerabilities. No? And society looks harder upon women who actually commit crimes than men. No? This vulnerability could also include risks of sexual violence, as we have said, during detention, even during arrest, prior to booking them, and other acts of torture and degrading treatment. So we've received complaints of WDL sexually exploited, as I've said, by arresting or detention officers. We have also received complaints of inhuman or degrading treatment, and complaints pertaining to the absence of gender-specific needs and services during incarceration. So when stigma is present in personnel and institutions meant to respond to their cases, this could really lead to a wide range of rights violations, from non-discrimination, violations to rights to non-discrimination and equality, to also, of course, the obvious ones, which is acts of torture, degrading treatment, to impunity and lack of accountability. I'm going to stop there, and just to say that there are invisible gender-specific needs and services, considering that they are just a tiny amount of the population, of prison population. Their services tend to be underserved. They are underserved, and they tend to be overlooked. Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists. I think they were able to paint a really clear picture of how complex the problems women in conflict with the law face. And these are not just different forms of discrimination. They face this as well from different groups in society. And I understand Judge Ason's frustration, because while you do want to affect all of these changes, there are the lack of resources, the inconsistent policies, but we're also glad to note that different actors are working on this already, the judges, the CHR, and organizations like Taiwan. At this point, I'm not sure if we can do another audience activity, Nadine, or we can
Yes.
move on to the next part.
So in the interest of time, I would suggest let's continue the conversation also, because I feel like there are a lot of good points made by the panelists, which as an audience, we can kind of relate, reflect on as we go through the session. And then, yes, to reassure, I've already checked with the panelists and they would stay on for a little bit longer for additional Q&A. So maybe if you have some burning questions or comments which you would like to share with this group, please write them in the chat or hold them off to later in the session. I'm going to hand over to Sai, who will provide us the questions for the panelists in the next couple of minutes. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Say Salvador, a lawyer from the Philippines and ICJ's legal consultant here. So now let's proceed to the next topic, which we will discuss through our panelists. It's many women, especially from marginalized communities and sectors, do not know about their rights and the laws or policies that can be invoked to protect these rights. Now, before we proceed to the panelists, allow me to provide a brief context. Human rights, are universal and interdependent. It is ours by virtue of us being humans. However, due to numerous barriers we face, not everyone is able to experience and enjoy these rights. In the context of women in conflict with the law, how do they navigate situations where they seek justice and the law's protections when they do not know their rights, or when the law seems so alien and so daunting to them? Now, what is society doing in order to help these women access justice? And also for individuals and groups who assist these women to invoke their rights, what are the challenges they face? These and some points will be discussed by our distinguished speakers. So, Attorney Kathy.
Hi, Say.
In your experience working with women in conflict with the law, what are the key barriers that hamper justice-seeking behavior?
Thank you, Say. As I said earlier, women, and I think Karen also mentioned that women who are entangled in the criminal justice system seem to be looked at in a more they face more judgment from the community and their families, and this view of them as having done something like a moral failure. I think it contributes to the challenges of seeking justice, justice-seeking behavior. But aside from that, there is also what we call self-stigma, where you yourself do not feel that you deserve to seek out justice, because you have internalized already the stigma that you experience from outside. And this is also compounded by their experiences of abuse during the different stages of the criminal procedure, I think it creates a lack of trust in the justice system, because how can you trust the justice system if you feel like this is where you experience being abused and being traumatized? So these are some of the things that happen which prevent women from seeking justice. But there is also a situation where because of like COVID-19, we had to migrate to online. The jails had to be locked down, and they have not been able to receive visitation from their families, which previously helped them follow up their cases. And then the hearings that have migrated online also require a lot of technology, which is very limited in jail. And even with the availability of e-dalaw for women in detention, there's still a lack of technology, and the families themselves might not be able to access. Everyone, we need access to data, access to a smartphone in order to be able to do that. And that was their way before the pandemic. That was their way to communicate with their lawyers. And now, when you ask them, because of the sheer volume of cases, no matter how hardworking the public defenders are or public attorneys are, there really is just there's just not enough time to be able to walk the women through their cases. And so, how can you establish trust if you only have a very short time to talk to your lawyers, and then you face challenges brought about by technology? You cannot speak with them face to face, things like that. All of these things contribute to that situation where women, even if they want to, are not able to seek justice. But I would also just like to say that there have been organizations, not just Street Law, who have been trying to bridge this gap. Uh, Again, I want to commend the very hardworking public attorneys who are really doing their best with the resources that they have, and the amount of cases that they're handling. It's just uh, my law students, when I tell them the number of cases that our POW are handling, they're like, whoa, because it's really just a lot. And then you have organizations like, I think we have a participant here from the Humanitarian Legal Assistance Foundation, uh, which has been consistently providing paralegal trainings in jails. Uh, uh, and these provision of capacity building inside the jails also try to bridge that gap. StreetLawPH is also doing it in our jails in Metro Cebu. And we've received a lot of support from institutions like the Integrated Bar of the Philippines, through their lawyers volunteer to provide assistance. They have raised funds to be able to purchase equipment so that the women in detention have more more access to facilities where they can get in touch with their families, and they can get in touch with their lawyers, and for the courts to continue to have hearings. So there are a lot of factors that prevent women from justice seeking behavior, but I also just want to say that there's still like glimmers of hope. There are small pockets of hope where the community is also trying to bridge that gap. So thank you, Say. I hope I was able to answer your question.
Thank you, Attorney Cathy. It really takes a community to help women in conflict with the law bridge the gaps, bridge the numerous gaps and challenges that they face. Okay, Judge Azon, do you recognize the issues that Attorney Alvarez is pointing out the impacts of COVID-19? There's overcrowding and congestion. These are not gender-specific issues, but also an issue for the male prison population. Do you see any differences in how females and male populations are handled?
I agree that the problem of COVID has exacerbated the conditions, and of both men and women, actually. And central to that is what I was talking about regarding, the developments in the law, where instead of us decongesting the jail, we are adding to more and more prisoners, despite COVID. When you want social distancing, we are jam-packing the jails. In 2020, at the height of the pandemic, I received 1,040 newly filed cases. And I'm just one of 3 drugs court in Cagayan-de-Oro. So times 3, that's like 3,000 newly filed cases in just 2020 alone. Now this year, it's the same thing. Every day, I sign detention commitment orders. Grabe talaga. I don't know. It's so frustrating. And knowing that there is COVID, but I don't know why. I think we should have, as they say, the whole of government approach. we have to put together different, the minds of the different pillars of the justice system and really look at this from a human rights perspective. Look at these people who are in jail as not just, these 2,000 people in jail. You multiply that by the number of families that are affected by their being in jail, but the number of possible COVID infections that are being generated by this extreme congestion in the jails. So anyway, regarding is that the different treatment, I cannot really say, because I was trying, in fact, to get some disaggregated data regarding congestion of male versus female dorms. I tried in Cagayan-de-Oro, but it appears that there's more congestion sa male dorm. But in the national, BJMP, they couldn't even give me the figures. In disaggregated. It's just in general. Although they say that the population for female is only 7%, the population of male is 92%. Okay, so I agree with Commissioner Karen that because of this, disparity in the number of male versus female, they tend to forget, the different needs of women. It is easy to forget that there are certain needs of women vis-a-vis the male population in the jails. That's all that I can say for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Azon. The fact that there's no hard data on a national level is truly telling, like it's missing. It's very telling of like how we are able to address the challenges that women in conflict with the law face. Okay, thank you again, Judge Azon. Com Karen, good afternoon. For you, Com Karen, like the Bangkok rules, the United Nations rules for the treatment of women prisoners and non-custodial measures for women offenders asserts the specific gender differentiated needs of women and the framework to address those needs. How can we work with policymakers to institutionalize laws and policies that protect the rights of women in conflict with the law in line with the Bangkok rules?
Thank you very much for that question. Just to be able to reiterate that we have a program right now with the Philippine government and the UN, kasama rin ang CHR dyan, and that's the UN joint program on technical cooperation and capacity building, which is something that we'd like to raise, of course, with UN Women, because UN Women is part of the UN country team in the Philippines. So that's the first. The first is to continue capacity building and also information dissemination, not only on the Bangkok rules, but also on the others, like Mandela rules, the guidelines regarding non-custodial measures, which are specific. I believe that's the Tokyo rules as well. Especially among policymakers. And this is not just to simply highlight all these rules, but more importantly, the why. Why do we need to continue discussing among detention facilities and officials or detention custodians why a gender differentiated standard is absolutely needed, so that we can also discuss the gendered nature of incarceration, and why an intersectional approach responding to women's diversity is important. As we said earlier on, why do women offend, or why do they find themselves in conflict with the law is certainly an elementary question that we should be able to ask, because most of these transgressions are really emanating from economic, social, and cultural rights deficiencies, and violations by themselves. The second is we want to continue to document and render women deprived of liberty, those women who are incarcerated, women in conflict with the law, how their lived experiences can be made visible. While part of convincing policymakers in institutionalizing the Bangkok rules involves invoking international commitments, for instance, as CEDAW, and also Convention on the Rights of the Child, because that was the first time that in the Bangkok rules there was a policy already of children with their parents in detention as well. The reality remains, of course, that policymakers need data. And we heard it a while ago, how the dire lack of data is really not guiding us through the proper policies that we must be able to recommend. No? So evidence-based dapat. We need to be able to provide this data either through the work of national human rights institutions such as us, or also of civil society organizations, and through the detention facilities themselves. And last is we need to strengthen working together. As Judge said, it's the whole of government approach, but not only that, it's the whole of society approach. Adopting a structural approach, we need to strengthen collaboration and also, of course, grassroots community-based efforts. And the persistence of gender equality, of gender-based violence in families and communities, the multiple burden of women are continuing realities that must be addressed during detention and even after. So this means that any approach that addresses the situation of women in conflict with the law, even those aligned with the Bangkok rules, have to deal with the persistence of this gender inequality. And we have to propose strategies that structurally address these barriers. No? And the experience from the community has actually shown, as Attorney Kathy has said, that manifestations of gender inequality are often directly related to women's experience prior to, during, and post-incarceration. That unless it is addressed, these could contribute and lead to reincarceration. But of course, emphasis in the Bangkok rules for non-custodial measures. Thank you.